So again, you might ask, well, what do you know about Titus and Timothy? And that's about what sums it up, right there. We know very little about them. They were two who at some point were part of Paul's discipleship, his group that went with him on his journeys. And along the way, according to what we have in the way of tradition, what we heard in that letter from Paul to Titus, Titus was left behind on the Isle of Crete, and there he was the one who served as what we would call today a bishop. And he was to appoint elders in all the communities around. Timothy would go to Ephesus, and that's where he would serve, again, in what we would call bishop. They didn't have bishops like we have today. There was something very different than that, but it was the beginnings of that. These were the ones who were the leaders of the church in those communities. And so the gospel that those people received, especially in Crete, because as far as we know, none of the other apostles went there. There's some tradition that Andrew went to Crete, but we don't know any of that for sure. Because usually those things come to us 100 or 200 years later. Somebody says, oh, yeah, that was... We don't know. But we do know that Titus and Timothy would have been the second generation. They would have heard the gospel along the way, and they would proclaim that to new communities, to people who had never heard about Jesus. They would be the ones who would tell them, like Paul, Titus and Timothy, as far as we can tell, never met Jesus because Titus and Timothy are not Hebrew names, so it's doubtful that they came from Galilee or from Judea. So they probably never met Jesus, just like Paul. Paul only had that momentary encounter on the road to Damascus. That was the only thing we know that he knew of Jesus. And yet, they came to know him in faith, and they proclaimed him along the way. And it wasn't just in what they said, but more importantly, it was in the way they lived. That's always the key. The saying is actions always speak louder than words, and there is great truth to that. Along the way it's been said that faith is something that's caught, it's not taught. It's something that people pick up from others. And when we look back in our lives and say, how did we come to believe? Usually we can find other believers in our life who lived it in a way that left a deep impression on us that remains to this day. And that's how we do that, I can say that there are a few people, but there are really lots of people who have been a part of that passing on of faith in my life. And I'm much richer for having that kind of experience. I think we all are. Today we celebrate, again, two men that we don't know much about, but that's okay. What's critical, what's most important, is they passed down the gospel. And they did it in their words, but also in their actions, the way they lived. And we are thankful for that. They are part of that group that the Lord Jesus sends out. In Luke's gospel, Jesus not only sends out the 12, but he would also send out the 72. These other disciples who followed him to proclaim the good news of the kingdom. And he sends us out to do the same. It's interesting that in the old days, those of us who are old enough grew up with the Latin. And at the end of the Mass, the priest would turn around and go, Ita missa est. And we would always say, go, the Mass is ended. That's the way we translate that in English, but that's not what it says. It says, Ita, go, missa est, it is sent. It means that Christ is sent out. That gift of the Lord goes out with us so that we can take that gift to the ends of the earth. There was a priest who I know who always ended the liturgy not by saying the Mass is ended, but he would say, go, now it begins. And I think there's profound truth in that. Because you and I, whether we are single or whether we go out in pairs, all of us are sent from here to proclaim the good news of the kingdom. That's our task. That's what we celebrate. That's why we're given the gift of Christ today, to take him to the world so that others might know him. That's what Paul did. That's what Timothy and Titus did. That's what we are all called to do, is give this gift that we receive to those who have never heard of him, and to give that by the way we live.